King Hyegong of Silla. King Hyegong was the 36th ruler of the Silla kingdom, and his reign, which ran from 765 CE to 780 CE, was essentially 15 years of the peninsula slowly tearing itself apart. Silla at this point was the unified kingdom, the power that had, in alliance with Tang Dynasty China, crushed both Goguryeo and Baekje by 668 CE, and then spent decades consolidating its control over the peninsula from the capital at Gyeongju. That unification was less than a century old when Hyegong came to power, which means the wounds of the conquered kingdoms were still fresh. The aristocratic factions that had survived the consolidation were still jostling for position, and the throne itself was not yet the unassailable institution it would need to be to hold everything together. Into this situation stepped a child king. Hyegong was approximately 8 years old at accession, and the consequence of that was immediate and catastrophic. Real power passed to regents and court factions before Hyegong was old enough to understand what was happening, and the vacuum at the center of Silla's political structure became a magnet for every ambitious aristocrat on the peninsula. The bone rank system, known in Korean as the Golpumji, was Silla's rigid hereditary class structure, and the true bone rank at its apex, the highest possible designation, meant that a relatively large number of powerful men considered themselves plausible alternatives to whoever happened to be sitting on the throne. During Hyegong's reign, the Samguk Sagi records approximately 96 separate aristocratic rebellions, a figure so staggering it almost defies comprehension. That is not 96 minor court squabbles. That is 96 documented uprisings, coups, challenges, and armed confrontations, averaging more than 6 per year across his 15-year reign. The kingdom that had managed to unify the peninsula within living memory was now being shaken apart by its own ruling class like a dog with a rope toy. The two most significant rebellions were led by Kim Yeonsang and Kim Yeon, both true bone aristocrats, both powerful enough to mount serious challenges, and both using the obvious weakness of the king as their primary justification. Why should we obey this man, the argument went, when he clearly cannot rule? The Samguk Sagi also records that Hyegong displayed an interest in women's clothing and activities, a detail that Confucian historians seized upon as evidence of fundamental unfitness for masculine royal authority. Modern scholars approach this detail with considerable caution. It appears in a text compiled 365 years after Hyegong's death, by an editor with strong Confucian values, and a clear interest in demonstrating that bad kings had bad character. Whether it reflects Hyegong's actual behavior, a political smear applied retroactively, or something that later generations interpreted through a Confucian lens that did not exist in Hyegong's own time, is genuinely impossible to determine. What is not in dispute is how his reign ended. In 780 CE, a coup led by Kim Yeon succeeded where 95 previous rebellions had failed. Hyegong was assassinated, killed alongside his queen during the palace takeover, and with his death ended the unbroken line of descent from King Muyol, the king who had engineered the original Silla-Tang alliance that unified the peninsula. After Hyegong, the Silla throne became a prize, something seized by whoever could put together enough military and aristocratic support to take it, and over the next 155 years, Korea's first unified kingdom went through king after king in an increasingly frantic succession crisis. That chaos eventually produced the later Three Kingdoms period, which ended only when the founder of Goryeo, Wang, Yeon, reunified the peninsula in 936 CE. In other words, one weak king, one reign defined by factional bloodshed and institutional collapse, contributed in a direct causal chain to more than a century and a half of instability. The capital at Gyeongju still stands today as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, full of golden burial mounds and temple ruins. And if you walk through it, you are walking through the physical legacy of Silla at its height. Hyegong's legacy is what happened when that height started collapsing. King Uija of Baekje. King Uija ruled Baekje from 641 CE until the kingdom ceased to exist in 660 CE, and the tragedy of his reign is that it did not have to end that way. The early records describe a ruler of genuine promise, described by court historians as talented, decisive, and notably filially pious toward his father King Mu, which in the Confucian-influenced court culture of 7th century Baekje was about as strong an endorsement as a prince could receive. His early military campaigns showed real effectiveness, and he pushed back against against Silla's territorial ambitions with enough success that Baekje's eastern border held for the first decade of his reign. Baekje at this point was one of the most culturally sophisticated polities in East Asia. Its craftsmen produced celadon and lacquerwork of extraordinary quality. Its Buddhist monks and artists had been instrumental in transmitting continental culture to the Japanese archipelago, and the relationship between Baekje and the kingdoms of early Japan was close enough that when Baekje eventually fell, hundreds of Baekje scholars, craftsmen, and nobles fled to Japan rather than face life under Silla rule. This was a kingdom with deep roots, genuine achievements, and real cultural weight. What Uija did with that inheritance, according to court records compiled in the Achal's eyes, Samguk Sagi, was gradually abandon the responsibilities of governance in favor of feasting, entertainment, and surrounding himself with officials who told him what he wanted to hear. The capable ministers who tried to give him honest counsel were dismissed or imprisoned. The military commanders who warned about Silla's growing alliance with Tang Dynasty China were ignored. The most documented case is that of the general and advisor Chungsuk, who was imprisoned on charges that, from the historical distance available to us, look suspiciously like his real crime was telling uncomfortable truths. When the Tang-Silla coalition finally invaded in 660 CE, and the Baekje court was in full panic, an official was reportedly sent to ask the imprisoned Chungsuk for his strategic advice, and Chungsuk, even sitting in a cell, provided a detailed and tactically sound assessment of how Baekje could still defend itself. The remaining court advisors rejected his recommendations, apparently because accepting them would have meant acknowledging that the man they had imprisoned was right all along. The invasion that followed was swift and devastating in a way that suggests Baekje's internal rot was as decisive as the enemy's military strength. The Tang general Su Dingfeng commanded a massive naval force that landed troops with striking efficiency, while the Silla general Kim Yusin advanced by land, and Baekje's defenses, which should have been formidable against any single enemy, crumbled against the coordinated assault within barely a month. The capital Sabi, located in what is now Goguryeo in South Chongqing province, fell in 660 CE. Uija was captured and transported to Tang, China, where he died in captivity, a humiliating end for the ruler of a kingdom that had existed for nearly 7 centuries. The cultural loss was staggering and arguably irreversible. The physical symbol of Baekje's fall, that Korean memory preserved most vividly, is the Nahwam, the Rock of Falling Flowers, a cliff face above the Bangmagang River near Goguryeo. According to tradition recorded in the Samguk Yusa, when the capital fell, the court ladies threw themselves from the cliff rather than face capture, their falling figures described as flowers falling from a branch. Whether this happened literally or as a later poetic tradition imposed onto a traumatic historical event is uncertain, but the Nakwam still bears that name today, and if you visit Goguryeo, you can stand at the base of that pale stone cliff above the Golden River and understand exactly why the story took root. Uija represents one of Korean history's most recurring cautionary tales, the ruler who had everything he needed to succeed, capable advisors, a culturally rich kingdom, a strategic situation that was difficult but not hopeless, and chose comfort and flattery over the hard work of governance until the choice was no longer his to make. Yeon Gaesomun and King Bojang of Goguryeo. The story of Goguryeo's final decades requires 2 names, because the man who holds the title of king and the man who actually held power were 2 entirely different people, and understanding that split is essential to understanding how one of the greatest kingdoms in Korean history destroyed itself from within. Goguryeo at its peak was enormous, a kingdom stretching from the northern Korean peninsula deep into Manchuria, sharing borders with China, controlling territory that dwarfed what either Baekje or Silla could claim. Its military tradition was legendary, its cavalry formidable. It had successfully resisted Chinese imperial pressure for centuries, including famously defeating the Sui dynasty's massive invasion campaigns in the early 600 CE, which contributed to the Sui's collapse. Into this powerful, battle-hardened kingdom, in 642 CE, walked Yeon Gaesomun, and what he did in the days that followed was one of the most brutally direct power seizures in Korean dynastic history. He invited approximately 180 senior court officials to what was presented as a military review and banquet, and had them all massacred. He then stormed the royal palace and killed King Yeongnyu personally, and the Samguk Sagi records that he did not simply kill the king, but dismembered the body and left it in a ditch, a deliberate act of desecration calculated to signal that the previous order was finished, and that those who had wielded power under it should feel exactly as vulnerable as a corpse in a drainage channel. He installed Bojang, a royal family member with no political base and no faction of his own, as king, and then created for himself the title of Daemagniji, position roughly equivalent to Supreme Military Commander and Chief Minister combined, a title he essentially invented because no existing title adequately described describe the totality of the power he had just seized. Bojang reigned from 642 CE until Goguryeo fall in 668 CE, and in that entire period, he appears in the historical record as almost entirely passive, a man who was nominally king of one of East Asia's most formidable kingdoms and had essentially no agency whatsoever in how that kingdom was run. The genuine historical complexity of this entry lies in what Yeon Gaesomun did with his stolen power, because the answer is that militarily he was extraordinarily effective. Tang Emperor Taizong, one of the most capable rulers in Chinese imperial history, personally led a massive invasion of Goguryeo in 645 CE and was repelled. She's two further Tang campaigns, in 647 and 648 CE, also failed. Goguryeo, under Yeon Gaesomun's military administration, defeated the Tang Dynasty 3 times, which is an achievement almost without parallel in the history of Tang's relationships with its neighbors. A man who came to power through massacre and ruled through terror also happened to be the most effective military defender Goguryeo ever produced, and a Korean historical memory has never quite resolved how to feel about that. The internal costs of his rule were severe and ultimately fatal to the kingdom. He purged anyone who questioned him. He rejected diplomatic flexibility that might have managed the Tang threat differently. He refused any meaningful alliance with Silla, which meant that after Baekje fell in 660 CE, Goguryeo faced Tang and Silla together with no allies of its own. When Yeon Gaesomun died in 666 CE, the system he had built, entirely dependent on his personal authority and military genius, had no structural resilience whatsoever. His sons immediately began fighting each other for control, and one of them, Yeon Namsang, made the catastrophic decision to defect to Tang and actively guide Tang forces against his own kingdom. Goguryeo, the kingdom that had humiliated the Sui dynasty and repelled Tang 3 times, fell in 668 CE, just 2 years after the death of the man who had been holding it together through sheer force of will and ruthlessness. Bojang was captured and exiled to Tang China. He later became involved in a scheme to restore Goguryeo among the Goguryeo diaspora population in Tang territory, for which Tang authorities exiled him again to an even more remote location. He died in obscurity, a man who had nominally been king of one of Korea's great kingdoms for 26 years, and had been, for the entirety of that time, a ceremonial object rather than a ruler. King Chungsuk of Goryeo. King Chungsuk has the distinction of being deposed not once but twice, which is the kind of achievement that speaks for itself, even before you examine the details of why. The Goryeo dynasty, by the time of Chungsuk's reign, was a kingdom that had spent roughly a century under Mongol domination following the devastating Mongol invasions of the 1230s through the 1270s, a period of such destructive intensity that significant portions of the Korean population were killed. Entire regions were depopulated, and the kingdom's institutional and cultural frameworks were severely disrupted. The political reality of Chungsuk's world was that Goryeo kings married Mongol princesses, spent extended periods at the Yuan court in what is now Beijing, and were partially puppets of Mongol political will, a situation that created a hybrid court culture caught between Korean aristocratic Confucian tradition and Yuan Mongol norms. His first reign ran from 1330 to 1332 CE, and ended when he was removed at Mongol insistence following complaints about his conduct from Goryeo's own aristocracy, which tells you something significant about the threshold that had been crossed. The Mongols were not known for delicate sensitivity towards subject peoples. For Goryeo nobles to appeal directly to the Yuan court, and for the Yuan court to decide that yes, this king is actually a problem that needs to be addressed. The conduct in question had to be egregious by any standard. The Goryeosa, compiled in 1451 CE by Joseon-era scholars who had their own ideological reasons to emphasize Goryeo's late-period decadence, on records Chungsuk as having committed multiple sexual assaults on the wives and daughters of court officials and aristocrats, including family members, with a degree of specificity unusual even for a text that documented royal misconduct with considerable detail. The Joseon editors of the Goryeosa were Confucian scholars who wanted to establish that the Joseon dynasty's founding was a moral rescue operation rather than a mere coup, so their framing of Goryeo's final century as a parade of corruption and excess serves a political purpose that historians rightly note. That editorial bias is real, but the core of Chungsuk's reputation does not rest solely on Joseon-era retrospective judgment. The fact that his own kingdom's aristocracy went over his head to the Mongol overlords to complain about him during his his first reign is contemporaneous evidence that his behavior was genuinely intolerable to those who witnessed it directly. He was also documented as having extorted money and goods from officials and merchants through direct threats, used royal authority to seize properties and valuables arbitrarily, and maintained a court atmosphere in which no official could safely object to his demands without fearing the consequences. He was allowed to return to the throne in 1339 CE, which on reflection seems like an extraordinary decision, and he resumed behavior similar to those that had gotten him removed the first time. His second removal came in 1344 CE, and this time the Yuan court sent him to Guangdong in southern China, an enormous distance from the Korean peninsula, making any possibility of return or restoration essentially impossible. He died there in 1344 CE, officially from illness, with the circumstances of that death not well documented enough to draw firm conclusions. His father, King Chungsuk, had also been a troubled ruler, suggesting either a catastrophic failure in royal education across generations or a court culture so distorted by decades of Mongol domination and factional manipulation that successive kings were raised without functional ethical frameworks. Changye represents what sustained foreign domination can do to a monarchy's internal culture. The constraints that were supposed to shape royal behavior, Confucian moral education, honest counsel, from scholars, the expectation of legitimate ministerial pushback, had been severely weakened by a century of external control, and Chungye is the most extreme product of that institutional erosion. King U of Goryeo. King U came to power in 1374 CE at approximately 10 years old, following the assassination of his father King Gongmin, and the circumstances of his accession immediately established the terms of his destruction. Gongmin had been one of Goryeo's more genuinely interesting rulers, a reformist who had worked to reduce Mongol influence on the kingdom as the Yuan dynasty weakened and the Ming dynasty rose, and his assassination left a power vacuum that various court factions rushed to fill. A 10-year-old king with no developed political base was not filling that vacuum. He was the shape of the vacuum. The faction that moved most decisively into the space around King Yu was associated with Yi Xiongye, a military general of growing reputation and ambition who would, within 2 decades, found an entirely new dynasty. Yi Xiongye and his political allies developed and spread a story about Yu's birth that became the most effective political weapon of the era. The claim that Yu was not actually King Gongmin's son at all, but the son of Shindan, a Buddhist monk who had been a powerful and deeply controversial political influence during Gongmin's reign before being executed. The monk's son accusation in Korean is associated with the phrase that became shorthand for illegitimate royal blood, and whether it was true, which historians consider at minimum unverifiable and possibly entirely fabricated, it was devastatingly effective as propaganda. A king whose birth was illegitimate was not a king. He was a usurper, and a usurper could be removed not just by coup, but by what could be framed as legal and moral restoration of rightful order. During Yu's reign, Goryeo was being squeezed in ways that would have challenged even a capable adult ruler. The declining Mongol Yuan dynasty to the north and the rising Ming dynasty to the northwest both demanded tribute, border concessions, and political deference, and the court's responses to these competing pressures were erratic and inconsistent. The Japanese Wokou pirates were devastating Goryeo's coastlines with increasing frequency, attacking coastal villages, disrupting trade, and undermining the government's ability to protect its own territory. The Red Turban Raiders had already attacked during the previous reign. Yu's government was navigating genuine external crises with a child king and deeply divided factional politics, and it was not navigating them well. The decision that proved fatal came in 1388 CE, when Yu's government decided to launch a military expedition against Ming-controlled Liaodong, an aggressive northern campaign that most of the kingdom's sane military leadership recognized as catastrophically ill-advised. Yi Xiongye was sent north to lead this expedition and made a different calculation. He marched his army to Wihwado Island, a small island in the Yalu River, and turned around. The Wihwado retreat, called in Korean the Wihwado Hyegong, is one of the pivotal moments in Korean history because Yi Xiongye did not just abandon a bad military campaign. He marched his army back to the capital Gaesomun and seized power. Yu was deposed. His young son Chang was placed briefly on the throne as a puppet. But Yi Xiongye's faction accused both Yu and Chang of being products of the monk Shindan's bloodline, and in 1389 CE had both of them executed, making King Yu one of the few Korean rulers to be killed, not in the chaos of a coup, but as a judicial execution after formal removal. Whether Yu was evil in any meaningful personal sense is genuinely contested by modern Korean historians. His reign was chaotic and his government corrupt, but nearly Nearly every problem he faced was either inherited from his father's assassination or created by the factional dynamics swirling around a child who happened to occupy the throne. The monk's son accusation is almost certainly the story Yi Seongye's faction needed, rather than the truth Yi Seongye's faction found. And the framing of Joseon's founding as a restoration of legitimacy rather than a military coup required Yu's delegitimization. He was a convenient villain for someone else's founding myth. Yeonsangun of Joseon. Yeonsangun is the name every Korean knows, the ruler who sits at the top of any honest ranking of Korean royal misconduct. And the historical record he generated is so extensively documented in the Joseon Annals, the Joseon Wangjo Sillak, one of the most detailed royal record-keeping systems in world history, and a UNESCO memory of the World Heritage Document, that there is no serious scholarly debate about the broad outline of what he did. He came to power in 1494 CE, following the death of his father King Seongjong, and his early reign showed no obvious signs of what was coming. The first years were relatively stable. The court functioned. Officials gave counsel, the machinery of Joseon's Confucian bureaucracy, which had been deliberately designed by the dynasty's founders to constrain royal power through layers of scholarly oversight and record-keeping, operated more or less as intended. Then Yeonsangun began to push back against the constraints, and what followed was a systematic escalation of violence against the class of people whose entire professional identity was telling the king uncomfortable truths. The Joseon dynasty had a specific category of officials called the sarim, the scholar official class whose Confucian training gave them not just permission, but an explicit duty to criticize royal conduct, and Yeonsangun's relationship with this class became the defining conflict of his reign. The first major eruption was the Muosahwa of 1498, the literati purge of 1498, which is the first of the four great Sahwa, or literati disasters, of the Joseon period. The trigger was a passage in the historical annals of King Seongjong, written by the scholar Kim Il-sun, which included a commentary originally composed by the scholar Kim Jong-jik, comparing a historical Chinese usurper to King Seijo, who was Yeonsangun's grandfather, and had taken the throne from his young nephew in 1455 CE. The comparison was pointed. Seijo had always been a sensitive subject for the royal family. Yeonsangun used the passage as justification to execute, exile, torture, and dismiss dozens of scholars. And in one of the more disturbing details of his reign, he had the already dead Kim Jong-jik exhumed and subjected to a posthumous punishment called Bugwanchamsi, the cutting of the corpse, in which the body of an executed or deceased criminal was disinterred and beheaded as an additional act of condemnation. Kim Jong-jik had been dead for years. Yeonsangun had him dug up anyway. The 1498 purge was severe and left the sarim class shaken. What came in 1504 was worse, more personal, more vicious, and driven by a grief that had curdled into something monstrous. Yeonsangun discovered, apparently with genuine shock, that his mother Lady Yeon had been forced to drink poison by King Seongjong's court in 1482, when Yeonsangun was a child. Lady Yeon had scratched the king's face during a confrontation, a violation of decorum that the court had treated as grounds for the severest possible punishment. She was executed. Her son grew up without her, possibly not knowing exactly what had happened or why. When he learned the full story as an adult king with absolute power, his response illustrated exactly what absolute power does when it is combined with unprocessed rage and no institutional check strong enough to stop it. He had the court ladies who had testified against his mother beaten to death, reportedly personally participating in the beatings. He had the sons of those women dismissed from their positions. He had the corpses of officials who had recommended Lady Yoon's execution exhumed and beheaded, applying Bugwanchamsi again, this time at scale. He executed living family members of people connected to the decision that had killed his mother, people who had been children themselves in 1482, and had nothing to do with what happened. The Gaesomun of 1504. The literati purge of 1504 was the formal name for this wave of violence, the second of the great Sahwa. Beyond the purges, Yeonsangun's behavioral record across his reign is remarkable even by the standards of monarchs with unchecked power. He converted Buddhist temples into personal entertainment venues. He expanded the royal hunting grounds so aggressively that he forcibly relocated entire villages from the land he wanted, and eventually expelled thousands of residents from the capital Hanyang, modern Seoul, because the noise and presence of ordinary people was inconvenient to his leisure. He conscripted women from across the country to serve as palace entertainers, called Hungcheong, maintaining hundreds of them in the palace complex. He had officials executed for offering honest counsel in court. and he issued a decree forbidding anyone from learning or using Hangul, the Korean phonetic alphabet invented by his ancestor Sejong the Great just 50 years earlier, apparently because Hangul had been used to post anonymous criticisms of his rule, and the simplicity of the script made it impossible to control who could use it. Banning Hangul was not just an act of self-protective censorship, it was an act of cultural destruction aimed at the literacy of the Korean people, a reversal of one of the most genuinely benevolent acts in Korean royal history. The Chungsuk coup of 1506 ended his reign while he was at an entertainment party outside the palace. The conspirators moved so quickly, and he was so isolated from honest information about his own court's mood that he never saw it coming. He was deposed and sent into exile, where he died the same year, officially from illness. His posthumous designation is Yeonsangun, Prince of Yeonsan, not a proper temple name, and not the dignified posthumous title granted to legitimate kings. The Joseon dynasty used that degraded form of posthumous designation only twice in its entire 500-year history. The other instance is the subject of the next entry. Gwanghaegun of Joseon. Gwanghaegun is the most historically contested ruler on this list, the one whose reputation has shifted most dramatically between his own time and the present, and understanding why he was condemned requires understanding the people who condemned him as much as it requires understanding Gwanghaegun himself. He ruled Joseon from 1608 to 1623 CE, a period sandwiched between two catastrophes, the Imjin War, the Japanese invasions of 1592 to 1598 that killed hundreds of thousands of Koreans and destroyed much of the peninsula's infrastructure, and the Manchu invasions of 1627 and 1636 that would humiliate the dynasty his successors led. He inherited a kingdom still bleeding from the first catastrophe, and navigated it directly toward the circumstances that produced the second, which is either the story of a pragmatist undone by ideologues, or the story of a man whose moral failures made him unfit to rule, depending on which Korean historian you are reading. His legitimacy was complicated from the start. He was the second son of King Seonjo, and not born of the queen, but of a royal concubine, and his older brother Hyegong was passed over for the succession on grounds of personal conduct rather than birth order, which meant the Confucian court never fully settled into acceptance of Gwanghae as the rightful heir. He had, however, earned genuine respect during the Imjin War itself, serving as a war-crowned prince who rallied provincial resistance, while his father King Seonjo fled northward toward the Ming border, getting as far from the Japanese armies as possible. Gwanghae organized supplies, coordinated irregular resistance, and demonstrated the kind of hands-on administrative competence under pressure that his father conspicuously lacked. When the war ended after 7 years with enormous Tongming military assistance, Gwanghae understood better than most of his court exactly how fragile Joseon's geopolitical position was and how much the military landscape of Northeast Asia was shifting. The Manchu people under Nurhaci were rising to the north and west, building the polity that would become the Qing dynasty and systematically dismantling Ming authority across Manchuria. Gwanghae's response was a foreign policy of deliberate strategic ambiguity, playing on both sides, honoring the alliance with Ming while not provoking the Manchus, which Korean historians call his neutral diplomacy, or Junglub Oigyo. When Ming requested Joseon troops to fight against the Manchus, Gwanghae sent a force under General Kang Hongnip with what historians believe were secret instructions. If the battle went against the Ming-Joseon coalition, surrender to the Manchus rather than fight to the death. The battle at Sarhu in 1619 CE did go badly for the coalition. Kang Hongnip surrendered as instructed. Gwanghae's Joseon was spared devastating Manchu retaliation. To the Confucian scholars of his court, this was a moral catastrophe of the first order. Ming China was not just an ally. Ming China had sent armies to save Joseon from Japanese annihilation. The debt of gratitude owed to Ming was, in the Confucian moral framework that structured Joseon's entire political culture, essentially sacred. Betraying Ming to accommodate the Manchus was not just bad strategy, it was an act of ingratitude so profound it constituted a violation of fundamental moral order. That framing, while it reads as rigid idealism to modern observers who can see the Manchu Qing replacing Ming entirely within decades, was not cynical politics to the people who held it. They believed it. The domestic acts that actually triggered his deposition were family-related, which in a Confucian political context meant they hit the most sensitive possible moral categories. He had his half-brother Hyegong executed, which was understandable as political self-protection given that Hyegong was a potential rival around whom opposition could rally, but which violated the Confucian principle of fraternal devotion with unmistakable clarity. More significantly, he confined his stepmother Queen Inmok within a small, restricted section of the palace, and stripped her of her formal title and status. When her young son, the Prince Yeonchong, died while in custody under circumstances that are not well documented enough to establish exactly what happened, the Joseon court's outrage was volcanic. Confining and degrading a queen dowager was an assault on the concept of maternal respect that the entire Confucian social order rested upon. Whether Gwanghae directly ordered Yeonchong's death, or whether the boy died of other causes in difficult circumstances is a question historians continue to debate. The Injo coup of 1623 removed him from power, framing itself as a moral restoration rather than mere usurpation, and installed King Injo, who promptly abandoned the neutral diplomacy, aligned fully with Ming, and was rewarded for this principled stance with two devastating Manchu invasions. The first in 1627 forced Joseon into a humiliating tribute relationship with the Manchus. The second, in 1636, the Byongji Horan, ended with Injo performing the ritual of submission before the Manchu Khan, bowing his head to the ground 3 times and knocking it against the earth 9 times, one of the most humiliating moments in Korean royal history. Gwanghae, watching all of this from exile, had in a very real sense been proven correct. He lived until 1641 CE, nearly 2 decades after his removal, spending his exile years reportedly composing poetry and maintaining a degree of personal composure that Yeonsangun, his predecessor in the category of rulers denied proper posthumous royal dignity, had never managed. The 2012 South Korean film Gwanghaegun, The Man Who Became King, brought his story to popular attention and leaned hard into the rehabilitation narrative, and modern Korean public opinion has shifted considerably toward viewing him as a pragmatist destroyed by rigid ideologues rather than a genuine villain. His posthumous designation remains the degraded form, Gwanghaegun, rather than a proper temple name, one of only 2 such designations in the entire Joseon dynasty's history. But the question of whether that designation reflects his actual moral and political record, or reflects the values and political needs of the people who removed him, is one that Korean historians have not finished arguing about, and probably will not finish arguing about anytime soon, which in its own way makes him the most interesting entry on a list full of interesting entries. If you want to see more, click the video. On screen now.